Okay, let's get started, I guess. I'm going to start with the the inconsequential things, in case anybody else is wandering in. I'm Martin McClure. I work for Gemtalk Systems on the Gemstone line of products, as you might be able to tell from the Gemstone shirt. Also, I have this little pin that I'm wearing, which I know those of you in the back can't read. Those of you in the front probably can't either. I don't know what F key to use to enlarge the font on the pin. But it is a Smalltalk balloon, and it says underneath it 30 years. This was, now you would think, since this is the 50th anniversary celebration, that I got this pin 20 years ago. But no, this was from the 30th anniversary celebration that was held 9 years ago using special Smalltalk mathematics. Like in the Green Book, where they say 3 plus 4 and they get 9, and they go, oh, Smalltalk works. So actually, this was the 30th anniversary of commercial Smalltalk. So different thing.
Well, speaking, wasn't it the birthday of Smalltalk 80, 1980?
No, it was in 2013, I believe.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yes. Yeah, it was a different thing, but I found the pin while I was packing. Yeah, the Blue Book didn't come out until '83. So I was waiting. I talked to you on the phone in '77 or '78, late '77 or early '78, trying to find information. And you told me we're working on it. Yeah, I called up Parks. I'd read the personal dynamic media article in Creative Computing, and worked up the nerve over a couple of months, and called up the Park Publications Department trying to order a copy of the Smalltalk 72 instruction manual, because that was that was in the bibliography of the article. And they said, well, that's been withdrawn. And they said, would you like to speak to someone in the Learning Research Group? And I went, I guess so, and ended up on the phone with you. So thank you for not entirely discouraging me, but it was a great day 5 years later when I walked into a bookstore and saw right facing the door, the Blue Book. I now have 2 Blue Books, because shortly after moving to Portland, my wife ran across one for $3 at a used book sale and said, Martin wants this. There's a reason I married her. Yeah, well, yeah, we will celebrate our 45th anniversary this year. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about Sparkle, which is it's an IDE for Gemstone Smalltalk that runs in Pharo. The IDE runs in Pharo. It is still very much a work in progress, and but the debugging tools are quite usable at this point, and today we'll see the current status of it. So why do we want a new IDE? And to understand that, you have to know a little bit about Gemstone. I know we've heard a lot about Gemstone so far this week, and but I'm going to give you the very, very brief overview of Gemstone from my perspective for the video people or the people who weren't here a couple of days ago. So it is often marketed traditionally as an object database that happens to run Smalltalk. I personally don't prefer that interpretation. I prefer that it's a Smalltalk implementation that happens to have a built-in object database. So with that, I will give the completely inadequate one-slide summary. Okay, so it's server-side Smalltalk. Image can be an order of magnitude bigger than your memory. Image can be shared by thousands of VMs on hundreds of hosts simultaneously, sharing their state transactionally. Persistence is by reachability. There's a single persistent root object, and from then on, everything that's reachable from there will become persistent when you commit. And there is no delete operation. We do garbage collection on disk. And there's no native GUI, because it's a server-side Smalltalk. So no native GUI, well, how do you have an IDE? Well, we've had a number of different IDEs, but the most popular ones are to have the GUI through a Smalltalk client. And there's been a number of these over the years. James talked about most of them on Friday. There's Jade, which runs in Dolphin on Windows. There's the traditional that Gemstone has produced for years, the Gem Builder for Smalltalk, which runs in VA or VW and historically in Visual Smalltalk Enterprise. And I've worked on that project for the last 20 years and more. So with those things to draw on, well, why a new environment? Well, we had a lot of customer requests over the last several years for wanting something that runs in Faro. And they said, why don't you port GBS to Faro? And GBS is large, GBS is complex. GBS was designed in the early 90s and uses some rather obsolete notions about how you should be able to do objects transparently across the network. And by the late 90s, we knew that transparently across the network leads to big performance problems, that you kind of have to know what's going on underneath. Our customers have been very successful using this, but they have to use particular patterns that it wasn't really designed to use. It was designed to not think about the network, but you have to think about the network when performance matters. And we had one particular customer that said, we need debugging tools for Faro. And particularly Faro 9, now it's Faro 10, but so we started out to do this. And so that was the Sparkle project. And one question you might have is, well, why did we call it Sparkle? And well, there is this. And sorry to disappoint any bronies in the crowd, this has nothing to do with the naming. The actual reason is more like this. You have a lighthouse for Faro. You have a gemstone for gemstone. And what do you think happens when a lighthouse interacts with a gemstone? You get sparkle. So there you go. Now, if you're building something new, then the question becomes, well, you want to improve things, but what do you improve? And the answer that came to me about that was, you improve the things that annoy you. And because we're talking about, a Smalltalk development environment. There have been Smalltalk development environments around for now almost 50 years, as we know. But they've looked quite a bit the same. There's been a lot of improvements over the years, but there are some things that have continued to annoy me year after year. So I said, well, let's just see if we can do something that reduces that. And I'm not entirely serious about that term, but it really kind of fits. It's annoyance relieving design is what you really want. And there are risks to doing this because you start changing things and it's easy to create new annoyances. In fact, it's easier to create annoyances than it is to get rid of them. Because making software annoying is incredibly easy, as anybody who looks at the software that's out there in the world today will realize. And some of the risk is that just by changing things, you take away some of the familiar things that people have, and that's annoying in itself, at least at first. The benefits of annoyance-driven design is that if you don't change anything, you'll never get anywhere. You'll always be where you started. So, so there's risks, there's rewards, and you try to balance those. And how do you do that? And the idea is that you iterate it, right? You try something. You see whether it's more annoying or less annoying than the other one. You see what the new annoyances are. You see what old annoyances went away. And then you go back and you redesign some more. And you do this relatively slowly because there's that initial annoyance of this is unfamiliar. I don't like this because it's unfamiliar. But once you, for something like a development tool where people are using it day in, day out, then you kind of want to look at what's still annoying after you've used it a while. So we're still, building the very first iteration of Sparkle, but that is, I want to hear about annoyances. At the end of this talk, I'm going to ask you to come up with annoyances that I haven't talked about, and I will take notes. Okay. So let's talk about some of the things we've improved, or trying to improve here. Some of the internal things. This is based on Gemstone 3.7, which is not yet released. As Norm said, we should be releasing that here in the second half of this year. There's a number of improvements in Gemstone 3.7 that we depend on. There's been improvements to ephemeron handling. There's been improvements to process scheduling. There's been we've added some internal low-level debugger API for use by this style of thing. And so if you want to try this out, you'll have to get a pre-release copy of Gemstone 3.7 from us. You can do that if you're interested. Other things were that most of our previous IDEs, basically all of them except the one that James demoed on Friday, go through the GCI, and James talked about why that's not great. You have to have a library that is specific to the version of Gemstone that you're dealing with and the platform that you're on. And one of the other things about the GCI is it's the fundamental interface to drive the virtual machine. So when you make a call from your client in the GCI that runs some Smalltalk code, it will run the Smalltalk engine until that returns. And when it returns to the client, Smalltalk execution stops. Even if you had other Smalltalk processes that could be running, it stops. So with Sparkle, we are relying on a new framework called Remote Service Replication, which Kurt is going to be talking about at 11:30 or so. And it is, so I won't go into too much detail about it, but it basically runs across a socket. So the Smalltalk engine starts up, keeps running, and it's just dealing with socket events, and it can run multiple processes at once and does that. The basic architecture here, we have a strictly layered architecture. We have a presentation layer in Pharo, and we have then the services layer is RSR, and these services are replicated across the two platforms. This is basically, I mean, it's kind of like the replication that GemBuilder for Smalltalk did and does, but it's much, much simpler, easier to port, and it doesn't try to hide the network from you, from the application developer. And those layers talk to a tools layer in Gemstone, which is basically your application model. And then those tools then actually send the messages to the actual domain objects, like the objects that you're inspecting. There's an inspector tool that talks to an actual object that's being inspected and gets information about it and then passes that up. So the services layer does a remote message sends and some state replication and some caching of information, and then the tools actually know how to manipulate the processes that you're debugging and the objects that you're inspecting. Okay, so that's kind of the internals. For user interface, that's really where the annoyances that the user would experience come from. So let's take a look at some of the user interfaces that I've used over the years and some of the things that annoyed me about them. Okay, this was my first user interface. An IBM 029, exactly.
You had the modern one.
Yeah, not the 26. I never had to use the 26. But only the professional key punch operators at the computer center got the 129 that could actually buffer a single card in memory so that you could actually backspace. And, okay, so the only good thing about this was that you could really actually program in it. And there's so many annoyances that I won't even go into them. One other good thing is it was easy to reorder your program, especially by accident if you dropped your card deck. I was a student. I was an undergrad. Undergrads never get a program stable enough to want to sequence it. Okay. No, and actually, this was only my first year of undergrad. I managed to wangle my way into the laboratory that had the terminals shortly after that. So I'm going to actually fast forward through all the dumb terminal days. Once for fun, just to try it. But, we were mostly doing PL1, and it wasn't really worth it. It was kind of a, what does this machine actually do anyway, kind of thing. So I'm going to fast forward to the first real environment. Okay. Let's see how this works out. And I can't see this on my screen, so I have to look up there. Okay, so what we have here, if I understand correctly, is we have the Apple developer program Smalltalk 80 running in Squeak, running on Squeak.js, running in Chrome, running in Linux natively on a MacBook Air that's 10 years old.
Is it faster than the Alto?
I never got to use an Alto, so I don't know. But I can tell you that it's probably, I think it's faster than it was running on the 512K Mac where I originally was running this in 1985.
$2 diameter, let's see.
They have, oh, this, okay. But we can do something. I mean, I do actually want to bring up this browser. So you can kind of see the speed there. Now, I do have, this version was hard-coded to the 512 by 342 pixel dimensions of the Mac screen. So this only ever ran on baby Macs. But somebody gave me an old SE30, and I loaded the 7 floppy disks onto the hard disk. And on an SE30, this thing runs like lightning with a 68030 processor. And it tells you something. So, so here you've got something that has, let's see what I had in here. So there's so many advantages to this over what I've been using before that it's almost not worth talking about. But there are those lovely flop-out scroll bars. This one had the extra wide flop-out scroll bars because there was an extra column for the menu, which was the adaptation for the one-button mouse. But there were annoyances in here that I didn't realize were annoying me until much later. But there's a number of annoyances, most of which have continued down to the present day in your basic browser structure that this introduced. Let's go look at some code here somewhere. I don't know what we've got. Collection. Adding. So let's actually let's do. It's been so long since I've actually used this thing. There's shortcuts that I'm used to using that I can't use. Let's actually define a little method. Okay. And Okay, so now we've added a method, and that's good. And you know, and in typing, you could undo, and undo was a new thing, and this was really cool. Let's go and, okay, I don't know what I selected there, because I spawned. Let's close that. Let's remove that method. Okay, and we get a prompt that says, are you sure? And we still see those. But this is an annoyance to me because I view every confirmation dialogue as a clue that you have a missed opportunity to make something undoable. And there's no real reason why removing a method can't be undoable. There's some things, you know, some things are harder than others to undo, right? And I understand that. But the easy things, it's like, you know, if you have a confirmation dialogue, think about whether or not you could make that undoable. I do want to remove that method. So what else do I have for, so undo being only for text is one of my annoyances here. In the browser, you can only see one method at a time. And when you only had this much screen space, I ended up in a sort of a three-browser working style, where I had a browser for the code I was writing, a browser that looked at where I could read the code I'd written before, and a browser where I could look at the base system code. And that was about all I could fit. But sometimes it would be nice to be able to have a better way that used less screen real estate. I'm trying to drag that window. I'm clearly not thinking. But actually, let's collapse this guy. And we have a workspace somewhere. Let's open a workspace. And let's inspect something. Okay, that's right. Shift click doesn't work. I guess I'll use that menu. And we get an inspector on the class set. And that's really much better than what came before. You get this. And now if I want to inspect that, I have to open another inspector window. And you end up with this profusion of windows if you're kind of like diving deep into these things. Also, there's generally in the user interface here, there's relatively few visible affordances. You have pop-up menus, and there's some things that have buttons, and that's about it, which was, it was well beyond state of the art at the time. But nowadays, it's like you have the ability to do more. You can't tell, in the browser, you can't tell whether you can't see a class method and an instance method at the same time. Since you can only see one method at the same time, that's probably not too bad. But sometimes, I end up looking for methods in browsers, and I'm on the wrong side. And I know they're like totally different, but they are related. So I see the class selected there, and it's like, why can't I see that? Oh yeah, I'm on the wrong side. I don't know if that's just me, but you can't tell whether you have unsaved changes or not. Some of the newer browsers have helped fix that. And in the debugger, I won't bother to bring it up in the interest of time, but you can only see one context at a time. So there's been many improvements since then. There are things like, there's syntax highlighting, there's code completion, there's refactoring tools, there's amazing stuff that have happened since then, but there are still some of these annoyances, that came from the beginning. So let's say goodbye Smalltalk 80 there. So let's look now at a thing that I did. What do we got next? Let's see. Come on, there we go. Oh, that's not what I expected. That's not what I expected. That's Newspeak. That's not right now. Oh yeah, here we go. So this is Squeak something or other. But what I've got loaded into here is a thing I used for a project about 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago now. If you were at Uppsala and went to a Squeak Bop about 20 years ago, you would have seen me demonstrate this program written in Smalltalk that uses a video camera, and you can make gestures and juggle planets on the screen. And I wrote that using a tool called the Whisker Browser. And the Whisker Browser is one of my favorite coding tools that I've used in Smalltalk. It's organized a bit more horizontally. The Smalltalk 80 browser was organized more vertically, and I don't know whether this has anything to do with the fact that the Alto screen was a portrait aspect ratio, whereas almost all screens since then are portrait or are landscape. But a more horizontal kind of way of thinking kind of works. So here you've got class categories and class hierarchy. And if I select something out of, well, let's pick on set again, maybe. Somewhere. Oh yes, I click on the arrow. Okay. And it appears over here. And then we've got the categories, and I can set add, and it appears over here. Now, the really special thing about this particular browser is that I can multi-select and get multiple methods at once, as many as I want. I can also look at the class methods at the same time as the instance methods. They appear with a little darker background, so you can kind of tell what you're looking at. And you can drag the boundaries between them if you need to. And it's also a little bit smart about how it allocates space. It kind of allocates space. It makes some guesses, but it actually allocates kind of based on how much text there is in there. It doesn't allocate it evenly. You can move things up to a point, but then you hit a boundary, and it's like, oh, I need more space for the thing down here, and it's like, I have to move this one, and then I have to move that one, and of course I can also multi-select classes and get another class in here and look at its methods, and it helps you distinguish between them by color in this case, which probably doesn't work very well for colorblind people. But I thought this was kind of cool, and I used it, for at least 200 solid hours of programming to develop this shadow juggling program that was used by a professional juggling troupe in a show. And I really liked some of the things about it. So you can also look at the instance variables of the class while it's here, and kind of get there, and it takes you back out to the traditional tools for the references, but the main browser is multiple. So there's that. Then we also, I think over on this side of the screen, we have Newspeak. Now, I'm not very familiar with Newspeak, and I'm at a really bad angle here. So let's see if I can actually do what I wanted to do. So there's some stuff in this UI. This is an older version of Newspeak that runs on the Squeak VM. The newer Newspeak, I guess, runs in JavaScript. But here it's you kind of have the same kind of thing where you can see multiple methods at once, by taking up vertical space. But you do have the collapsed ones in between, which take up extra space, which seems kind of iffy to me. You also do have some more affordances. You've got things that will give you this actually is a menu now. I think originally it just brought up who's talking about me, who's sending this and who's implementing it. But then you've got the senders that you can get and various things like that. So this had continued with the idea of multiple objects or multiple methods being available at once. And they also carried that, Vasily Bykov, who designed this, carried this into the debugger as well. Let's see, how do I click on evaluate, right. And we get a debugger, and it has, and this is not a very interesting debugger, but it has, but you get the call stack, and you can then open in place the things that you're interested in. But you do have, if you've got a very deep stack, you still have to take up space for all the collapsed frames between. But if you've got one that's down here that you're interested in and one that's up there that you're interested in. And you can continue this or you can terminate it. And you can look at the variables and evaluate things, and there's various things of doing that. So, checking my time, so I have Newspeak. And then going past Whisker. It's hard to know when this thing will actually switch screens on me. Now I'm back to there. Now I'm back to there. Maybe I should go the other direction. Just for a moment. There we go. All right. What are we in? Well, in the Sparkle looking image. I want the Pharaoh 8 image for right now. So in Pharaoh 8, there was I don't think I changed anything here. So they used the Fink guys, Doro and so on, used that wasn't what I wanted. Okay. So they introduced this GT browser or GT inspector, and you click on something and it gives you something, and you click on something there and it gives you something else, and it shifts left, and you've got something more there, and you can kind of scroll back and forth in this to see where you are. You can also expand this so that if you have the screen room, you can get multiple columns, more columns. Unfortunately, in Pharaoh 9 and 10, they broke that capability to get multiple columns. I mean, you can still get multiple columns, but if you try clicking on something, it'll just error on you. So this is kind of interesting, but there's some things using it, and I used it quite a lot, that you can't move the dividers. It's always equally divided, and not all objects are equal. Just send them the equal message, and they'll tell you that. So that was a bit annoying. But one of the things that I did get is that from the GT guys and Doru's presentations at conferences was this notion of everything is an inspector. And like, a browser is a specialized inspector on code, and a debugger is a specialized inspector on a process. And that kind of, made me think a little more about, that there's truth there. The other thing that's good in Pharaoh that I'm not going to demonstrate for time is they do give you a little indicator in the browser as to whether or not you have unsafe changes. And I really liked that. So let's go on and look at Sparkle. That is in is this one, and hopefully the other one's behind it. Yeah, okay. So I've got a Gemstone server running, and we've got Sparkle Launcher here, and I've got some expressions over here that I'm going to use in a minute. So I'm going to connect. So here we have a Sparkle Explorer window, and it has one evaluator that will evaluate the code that you put in it, and it is also an inspector on nil, because I thought about this and I said, well, what is a workspace except, the evaluation pane of an inspector where the context is nil. So I didn't bother to make a separate workspace particularly. I made just an inspector on nil. And you can type code here and then evaluate it. So let's just take sat. Oops. Yes, and you can get as many evaluators as you want on a single inspector, because the mode here is not of do it, of select the code and then execute it. It's type as much code as you want and then execute the whole thing, right? And if you want separate pieces that are separately executable, usually you get separate inspectors. There probably will be a do it added at some point. I haven't actually added that yet. As I said, very much work in progress. Oops. What did I do? The right control key. There we go. So if I now accept that, there's my little, you have unsaved changes notice that is the same as the one in Pharo. If I accept this, then it splits into another column. And we get the class set and everything that's in that. And we can then look at its method dictionary and see that. And you can dive into this. What do we have? A method. So there we have a compiled method with bytecodes in it, which you may notice are bigger than a byte because this is Gemstone. And you can also, unlike the squeak or the Pharo inspector, you can move these dividers around, and they will actually squish the other columns. I'm using a kind of a cheap linear algorithm for this that isn't very smart. It isn't very smart. I've got another algorithm in the works, but it's not implemented yet. But you can say, I need more space for this column, and it'll squish the ones to the right. Or I can say, oh, I want more space for the column to the right, and it'll squish the ones to the left. And that also works vertically because, of course, you can select multiple things here. Everywhere you get these little green triangles, you know that you've got something that you can click on and create a new pane in the next column. When it's a big, heavy triangle, you've got one over there. Here you've got some clue as to what you linked from. And there's this little unlink button. That's a feature that's in progress. But if I say, oh, I want to unlink this and make it independent, I can click on that, and it makes a new window, and then it's no longer in the old window. And that appears to work, but believe me, it actually doesn't work the way it should, because I need to redo some of the caching stuff to make it really work. I mean, this was the stuff I was implementing, the day before I flew out here. Well, no, the day before I was packing. But the last time I touched the code, which was only a few days ago now. So you can get more vertical things. Here in set, of course, we can get ourselves an evaluator. We don't get one by default here. Yeah, yes.
The order that came from the right matches the solid green triangles on the left.
Correct. The order always matches, yes. And if I have multiple things here, like, what do I want to say? And so I can have multiple objects here, and if I put them here, then all of the things I select here will be below the things over there. Right now, we don't have the color that the Whisker Browser used to just help you navigate. I do want to add some things. You notice how you get this very subtle highlighting as you scroll over a list in Faro. I would like to kind of combine that with, if you mouse over something that has a linked pane, you get a subtle highlighting of that pane. So you can kind of just mouse through here and kind of get, oh, I want this thing, and that thing highlights. And similarly, if I mouse over this I'm linked from, it can kind of highlight the thing it's linked from to help navigate. And you know, this is a thing that I think is going to need some research to see how much navigational aids are required for this to be effective for people, and how to make it, you know, and which kinds of aids are the most effective. But those are my ideas right now. So that's inspecting. We do have, I'm going to close this one, the string. Now I can close that by just clicking on that.
You were starting to explain something about the evaluation wasn't automatic, and you got the question changed.
Oh, okay. Right. You don't automatically get an evaluator in an inspector, except when you first open the window, you get that. Because when the window first opens, you get an inspector on nil, right? So if I say I want an evaluator here, it gives me an inspector on nil, and it gives me an initial evaluator there automatically, because what else are you going to do with an inspector on nil? There's really not a lot interesting about nil. I mean, nil's very actually interesting from a theoretical standpoint, but when you're developing, you don't need to inspect it very often. So here, but here in set, I'm going to give myself a window, and I'm going to say self with, actually I'm going to take this, except I'm going to say self. Just to prove that we are binding the okay, so here we get an inspector, and I'm just gonna, well, no, I'm just gonna, what am I gonna do? I'm gonna get rid of a few of these. But here we have a set that has, you know, an array of years 50 of Smalltalk, which is something Yoda might say, I guess, if he were here. But you know, it is giving me the contents of the set, and it's giving them to me currently in strict alphabetical order of the print string. Is that the best way to do it? No, but it was a reproducible way to do it, and a predictable order at least. I don't know what other orders are good, but we do have, this is a quite new feature just implemented over the last few weeks, of the ability to have inspector views. Right, this is not the raw, this is not the internal structure of that set. This is the contents of that set, and you do want to have those smarter views. Those have been there since Smalltalk 80. So here we have a little menu of the views. We're now in set view. We could go to raw view, and we would see the internal structure of it. If we go to set view and we select one of those, we are now looking at the array. If I change my view over here to raw and look at the internal implementation, then I can also see that. And so this is kind of an interesting question, is that you now have a linked pane that's linked from something that isn't visible. But this is going to, here we have, this is a result of the evaluation of the string set. And if I were to re-evaluate this, then I say it's the evaluation of good morning, in quotes. This is also, because this just got added, I haven't actually programmed in the strings for something else, but I want to have everything kind of give the best possible clue as to what it's actually linked from, to give you an idea there. But as you go back to the other view, you can see the things that are, well, why isn't that working? Oh, there it is. It's mostly, I guess, that I just can't see what I'm actually clicking on. Okay. so we're getting fairly close to where I should stop time, but let me get rid of all that and get rid of some of these evaluators. And here's a thing that I like to copy that, paste it over here. So SPK test subclass of nil is a subclass of nil, and it implements no methods. Oh, yes, this would, okay, here. I meant to demonstrate this anyway, but with a different string. So let's look at that. Okay, so we get a debugger, right? So, and it doesn't have a lot of frames in it, but here we can look at the executed code frame. And notice we're now looking at two non-contiguous debugger contexts. This one's not very interesting, so we can get rid of that one. And here it shows where we are. And then there's a does not understand that's also internal. So not the most interesting debugging state, and I guess we'll look at another debugger. But I'm going to terminate that process, and it tells me, oh, this process terminated. And I'm going to get rid of that, as you suggested, so well. And I'm going to accept that. And what we get is an inspector on this object. Now this is a subclass of nil. It has no methods in it. It does not understand, does not understand. So this means that the inspector is not sending any messages to the object. Now if you try this in Pharo, your image will crash. It will take the VM down. If you try sending a message to an object in Gemstone, you'll get a runtime error instead. If it does not understand, there will be an exception thrown rather than the VM exiting, as was traditional in Smalltalk 80. But you can actually see this, and it has instance variables, which are nil, of course, because there's no initialize method. But we can actually assign to those instance variables. Yes.
The reason that the IDE does not send those kind of messages to the object is to properly boot the proxy. This is related to that?
Yes. Yes. It should. I mean, we found we have proxy objects in RSR, and we found that you had to subclass from object or you could not debug anything. Even proto-object, which was designed for that, the tools in Pharo now actually send all kinds of messages that aren't among the 60 or so messages understood by proto-object. But they have in Pharo, and we have in Gemstone, a reflection or mirror API that lets you look at the basics of objects without actually sending them any messages. So it's like, why not use those? That's what they're there for. So here we have, the result of that was, of course, the string. And we have a bug that I discovered while I was preparing for this talk that I don't see that change there. And I've written that bug down. That will be fixed very soon. So I'm going to actually inspect this, and then we will see the properly updated thing that it did actually assign to that instance variable. No, not again. There we go.
I think in one annoyance might be having to click on the hamburger icon to go to the menu and select from the menu. If you could have buttons at the top, then it would be one click.
For these, I'm only doing that for the demo.
Okay.
Usually I use the command, the control key,
Oh, I see.
which is listed. The control keys work in this context, and I would normally be using those. But yes, no, your point's a good one. For people that like to use the mouse instead of the keyboard, there's, you know, yeah, there's room to move there. And I don't know exactly what the real good point is.
I would think that except would be one that you should have there. Maybe you don't need to debug the other one, but
Maybe.
the rest would be,
Okay, so let's go back to this example here. And I'm going to select that before now. Now I copied instead of pasting. Let's go back here, copy. Okay, and now I'm going to debug. Okay, so we get the debugger that we saw here. And here, because you've got all of these, you can have multiple contexts selected. The step into, over, step through, step over, and rewind are specific to the individual context. So when you have more than one context, then the controls have to be specific to the context. So those controls sit beside every context. And we can step through some of this, and I don't know. But you can see that this actually goes through, and I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to go into everything that you can do with that. I'm going to show, but the basic operations, work, and you can then continue or terminate the process. And of course, these things all have hover help. You can also look at all of the processes that are running in that particular VM. And what they're doing, there's a couple of them you can't actually debug because they are the ones that RSR is using to actually communicate to the server. And if you tried to debug one of those, you would be dead. So we don't allow that. But anything else, you can actually go and here I have an evaluation process, which is this one. And it's suspended, which it should be. And I can click on, well, I can inspect it. That's just a normal inspector on a process, raw at this point. But I can also press this debug button and get a debugger on it in a new window. Well, okay, so here I've got two debuggers with on the same process. So what happens if I, like, let's step, okay, and let's down here and step down here. So if I step over, well, I mean, both debuggers update. So I don't know whether this is useful to have more than one debugger open, but the user interface implied that you could do it. And it didn't seem like a terrible, terrible thing to do. I mean, no bad thing happens because you open more than one debugger. So I didn't see any reason to prohibit it.
Just an inspector.
It's just, yeah, I don't like prohibiting actions that don't have bad consequences. So that's pretty much the state of Sparkle as it is right now. Let me see here. So yeah, okay. So it's on GitHub. It's MIT licensed, and I guess we have a very short amount of time to talk about what your annoyances might be that I haven't covered, or that I haven't thought of, or what you find initially annoying about this design, and other annoyances that you've seen. Oh, anybody? Hi, Jan. You're hiding behind me.
You asked for annoyances.
Yes.
Obviously, I haven't used the thing. But my experience is that what particularly annoys me is when I'm working in the IDE on evaluating things, and the window just gets resized, which is the core of your thing.
Yes, right.
You click something to evaluate, and then something that was that big becomes that big or moves away out of the visible area.
Right, yes, and that is, that's a hard one But I do understand that it is hard to follow the size changes. And I've had a couple of thoughts about that. One is to animate it very quickly so you can see it changing not as a jump but as a slide. The other thing is that right now, well, I've taken it away. When a column becomes empty, the column goes away and the other columns expand. And I've considered making empty column just have an empty column with a button that will close the column so that it's actually a separate action to do that. Which gives you a little more, at least on the horizontal axis, that gives you more control of what's going on. And I think also once the allocation of space is smarter, so that for a short method or an inspector on an object with very few items in it, then it won't adjust the sizes of the other things very much. But yeah, this is definitely a trade-off between being able to see multiple things at once without overlapping them. And of course you can, as we saw, you can split things out into multiple windows if that's the way you want to work with it. If you want to take a whole different world and put it over there. I found it really nice when developing in the Whisker browser to be able to see a lot of, I mostly just full screened the one browser and worked in the one browser across different areas of code, and it was really nice. So yeah, I hope you get a chance to try it out and see what you think once it's a little further along.
And the second thing I would find a little bit annoying is that you add the support for these multiple different views on the object. And traditionally, there were tabs. In VisualWorks, in Smalltalk, and I think the advantage of the tabs is that you immediately see that there is something more.
Yes. Yeah,
Here you have to click, so unless you get the idea or you just are desperate and start searching, you don't know that there is a different view. Obviously, I understand that this is a way of taking more space.
yes.
And
Yeah.
the space is precious, even though we have all 49 inches screens now.
Right, yeah. Yes. Well, the last time I did an expanded version of this talk for the UK Smalltalk user group, that video is out there if you want the fuller version of this talk from January, so not all the features were in yet that were here today, but the video's out there if you want to see that. But yeah, I did that on my 42-inch monitor at home. I think you're probably right about the views, because the views, the choice between tabs and menus is one of quantity. And I think that most objects won't have more than about 3 views possible. So tabs is probably a better choice for it. For things that are, when you're starting to get narrow columns, then tabs don't work as well. And the menu works no matter how narrow you make that column. But yeah, I think tabs may be a good choice for that. This is something that we've been, kind of talking about.
Counterpoint, Martin.
Yes.
When you were going between raw and set or whatever it was,
Mm-hmm.
I was looking at it and saying, but sometimes you're going to want to have both at the same time so you can see how it compares.
Yes.
So having tabs makes that virtually impossible. Having a menu, you can change them to checkboxes or check items.
That's an interesting idea.
I don't know what the right answer is, but I want you to keep that alternate in
Okay.
mind.
I'm taking a note. You can, of course, get that now. It's just less convenient, and I don't know how often you'd want to do that. But if you open an evaluator in an inspector and say self, then you'll get another inspector on the same object, and you can make them be in different views. And given that that's probably something you don't want to do very often, maybe that's good enough. But I'm definitely taking a note. Okay. Well, unless there's an urgent question. Richard has an
One
urgent
more
question.
annoyance. One of my pet peeves is, as developers, we're provided with these wonderful tools, and virtually none of them give you the facility to get inside the tool and find out how it works, what the classes are, or anything else. So I would always like to see the ability to inspect the window or the pane or the whatever
Right.
and get my hands on the implementation so I can understand what's going on. And in the case of Sparkle, we'd want to be able to do it both for the client code and for the server code.
Right.
Little things now.
Well, and I played around a few years ago with the GT for, the GT for Gemstone toolkit, and it was able, you were able to do some interesting extensions. You're not into the browser stuff, but I found it really useful to be able to modify the inspector, the debugger to show additional information that I wanted that was related to my domain,
Right.
domain situation.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, I've always had this probably unattainable vision of being able to take a GUI window and, click on the inside access and literally like open that window to look behind it at the wiring.
Yes.
But, those visual programming tools work until your complexity gets too high, and then they become problematic.